class. We are beginning today with the administration of Warren G. Harding and the election of 1920. We have finished World War I and the Wilson administration. The Republican Party in 1920 turned for leadership to Warren G. Harding. He was fair-haired, prosperous, backslapping, small-town newspaper editor of the folksy type from Ohio. Quite the opposite of Wilson, who had earlier noted the senator's disturbingly dull mind. So, formerly, Virginia had been the mother of presidents. Now the new mother of presidents, Ohio. And despite grave doubts as to his mentality and morality, certain cigar-chomping bosses helped to engineer his nomination. But when it came to the vice presidency, they nominated a frugal, grim-faced native of Vermont, one Calvin Coolidge. While being raised in Vermont, he had been living most of his adult life in Massachusetts. He was given the nickname of Silent Cal, and he had been serving as governor in Massachusetts. The prime slogan used by Warren G. Harding was that of return to normalcy. We were tired of all of what had gone on under Wilsonism and World War I, and he said, let's get back to the good old days. Let's have a return to normalcy. The problem was, Wilson had noted the Senator Harding's disturbingly dull brain. There is no such word as normalcy. It's normalcy, return to normalcy. But he could not pronounce that, and so he always referred to it as return to normalcy. And to this day, that has become part of the English language because of Warren G. Harding, return to normalcy, but actually return to normalcy. And for President Warren G. Harding, Harding and Coolidge, Warren G. Harding for president. Republican candidates. They've got Coolidge, Harding, and this was probably a local piece. So whoever was running locally as governor, senator, House representative, some person like that would have been on this button with them. Harding and Coolidge for president, Harding and for vice president, Coolidge. The Democrats turned to wealthy Ohio newspaper editor, the earnest and energetic Governor James M. Cox. So here you have two Ohio people, both from the newspaper background. He owned the Marion Star, Marion meaning the town it was from, the Marion Star newspaper, and he is editor also of an Ohio newspaper. So two Ohioans with newspaper backgrounds. How could you get more close than that? The vice presidential nomination went to the young Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a tall, handsome, vibrant, 38-year-old New Yorker. He had gained some fame as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The correlation between Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt is uncanny. Both, of course, being related, come from New York. Teddy is from the Oyster Bay New Yorkers, whereas Franklin is from the Hyde Park New Yorkers. One is Republican, Teddy. Franklin is Democrat. One will go to Harvard, one will go to Yale. Both will serve as Assistant Secretaries of the Navy. Teddy was Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the Spanish-American War broke out. Remember, Secretary Long was Secretary of the Navy and Teddy was assistant. And when Long was away on vacation, extended weekend, Teddy was the one that ordered Dewey from Hong Kong to take his ships down to Manila Harbor. But he couldn't see action as assistant secretary, so he resigned his position to join the volunteers and serve as a Rough Rider in Cuba. Both will run for the vice presidency. Teddy will win under McKinley. Franklin will lose under Cox. Both will run for the presidency more than 2 terms, breaking President Washington's 2-term anti-dictatorial tradition. Teddy had served 7.5 years and then would run again despite his promises not to in 1912 when he ran against Taft and Wilson. Franklin will run 4 times and be successful all 4 times. He will die 4 months after his 4th election. So many similarities between these 5th cousins. I think it's 5th cousins. Between these 5th cousins. So Cox from Ohio takes on Franklin Roosevelt from New York. So a Midwesterner, we don't consider Ohio Midwest today, but back then that was considered a Midwesterner. Takes on an East Coast, very electorally potent state of New York, whereas Warren G. Harding, an Ohioan, takes on a New Englander from Vermont, so picking up someone from the East Coast. And here you've got Cox and Roosevelt. Cox and Roosevelt, once again, Cox and Roosevelt, campaign buttons. As campaigns go, this one was rather listless. A confused Harding. Initially, the party tried to keep him to the front porch, but he made a number of contradictory statements. He was, though, still swept into the presidency by a tremendous tidal wave of ballots. The 19th Amendment had just given the women vote months earlier, and Harding won 404 electoral votes to Cox's 127, almost twice as much as Cox in the popular vote. Many people have said Warren G. Harding was a very good-looking man, very well-liked, very gregarious. And people have complained, the first time you gave women the right to vote, what did they do? They voted in the good-looking guy. They voted in the stupidest president we have ever had. Yes, unfortunately, Warren G. Harding goes down in the record as being the dumbest president in United States history. Well, women, don't you let them sell you that for 1 minute. They have done studies where they extracted the female vote from the male vote. And if the females had not voted in the election of 1920, guess who would have been elected president anyway? Yes, Warren G. Harding. The men would have elected him without the women voting anyway. So the whole nation was ready for a return to normalcy or normalcy. Eugene V. Debs. Yes, there was a strong third-party candidate. Strong is a relative term here. Eugene V. Debs ran as a socialist candidate. He has run before as a socialist candidate, but this is the strongest that he will ever run and the strongest that the Socialist Party will ever run in the United States. They will win 919,799 votes, almost 1 million votes for their candidate, federal prisoner number 9653 at the Atlanta State Penitentiary. Yes, he had done something that had landed him in the penitentiary. I love this cartoon from the time period. Here he is looking out his prison bars at the White House. And he says, anyhow, where there are worse places than a front porch. Yours for the presidency, Eugene V. Debs. And he's got his speech ready. And yes, he is federal prisoner number 9653. And there's his mugshot. Socialist Party for President Debs. Workers of the world unite. For president, convict number 7653. I would love to have a legitimate, not a fake one, but a legitimate one of these pins from the 1920 election. Imagine, convict running for president. Yes, Eugene V. Debs. Remember, the muckraking movement, the progressive movement during the turn of the century, 1900s. The whole idea was to clean up capitalism, so socialism, so communism couldn't take root. And the fact that Eugene V. Debs, the highlight of the Socialist Party, never was able to poll a single electoral vote. Almost 1 million votes for him. Now, there were some lesser candidates from other interests, so that we ended up with almost 1.5 million votes for the socialists and others in the popular. But as far as the electoral, no, nothing was able to be achieved in the electoral college. In the popular vote, Harding is a majority candidate. He wins 60% of the popular vote. In both elections, Wilson was a minority president. He had under 50% of the popular vote. And in, of course, the electoral, he has more than 60%. He has over 75. He has 76% in the Electoral College. So Harding takes the nation. And remember, the Democrats, the Solid South. Yes, the Solid South here is still solidly Democrat. Only Tennessee and Missouri are not taken by the Democrats. Public desire for a change found vent in a resounding repudiation of high and mighty Wilsonism. In fact, "Down with Wilson" was a slogan of the period. People were tired of professional highbrowism, star-reaching idealism, bothersome do-goodism, nor moral overstrain, and constant self-sacrifice. Remember, Wilson was always on some kind of moral crusade. Eager to lapse back into normalcy, they were willing to accept a second-rate president. What they got was a third-rate president. And Harding's inauguration. Warren G. Harding of Ohio takes oath as 28th president. And here is Coolidge and Harding. Complete text of President Harding's inaugural address. Common Man didn't get to the inauguration. And so this is before TV. And so at that time, if you wanted to know what the president said, his plans for the nation in his inaugural address, you would have read it in the newspaper. Interesting enough, Wilson is unable to be witness of Harding inauguration. Apparently, Wilson rode to the inauguration with Harding, but remember, Wilson has suffered his stroke. He may have not felt up to the whole how long the ceremony and everything would have taken place. And so once getting to the Capitol and arriving for the ceremony, Wilson, it looks like, I haven't done any research on this other than seeing the newspaper here, might have stepped out and left at this stage. But here is Warren G. Harding being sworn in by the Justice of the Supreme Court, and him giving his inaugural address. Warren G. Harding right there. Gamaliel, Warren Gamaliel Harding. And after the inauguration, we've got Harding, his wife Florence, Coolidge, and his wife Grace. I love those feathers. Both the ladies have feathers on their hats. Handsome President Harding stood 6 foot tall, had broad shoulders, high forehead, bushy eyebrows, and graying hair. He was one of the best liked men of his generation, an easygoing, warm-handed first-namer. He exuded graciousness and love of people. Harding loved people. He wanted more than anything in life to be loved by people. He got along with people. He did anything to make people like him. Yet the amiable, smiling exterior concealed a weak interior. With a mediocre mind, Harding quickly found himself beyond his depth in the presidency. God, what a job, was his anguished cry on more than one occasion. Harding, like Grant, was unable to detect moral corruptness in his evil associates, and he was soon surrounded by his poker-playing, short-sleeved cronies of the Ohio gang. A good guy, Harding was one of the boys. He hated to hurt people's feelings, especially those of his friends, by ever saying no. And designing leeches capitalized on his weakness. The difference between George Washington and Warren Harding, ran a current quip, was that while Washington could not tell a lie, Harding could not tell a liar. This weakness is the same weakness that Grant had. Harding surrounds himself with his friends and will be tenaciously loyal to his friends. He does not see evil or corruptness in his friends. Grant was the same way. Grant was not a politician. He was a military man. He surrounds himself with his friends, and he does not see corruptness or evil in his friends. He is tenaciously loyal to his friends, even when they're caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Both men have the exact same weakness, and both men will subject the United States to the most corrupt administrations in United States history. Harding, who had admitted his scant mental furnishings, had promised to gather about himself the best minds of the party. This he did, but the best minds of the cabinet were largely offset by two of the worst. And we'll get to those in a minute. Meanwhile, well-intentioned but weak-willed Harding was the perfect front for enterprising industrialists. Their plea was not for government simply to keep its hands off of business, laissez-faire, let flow, but for government to actually act as an advance agent for business. In short, let Washington assist and protect industry, not regulate or hobble it. So Republicans, business is everything. And the Republican machine will use Harding to make sure business prospers. The Supreme Court was a striking example of this trend. Harding would live less than 3 years as president. He will not serve out his full term. But to him will fall the task of appointing 4 of the 9 justices. Wow, wow. Much of Harding's term in office will outlive him in the justices that he appoints. His term is 3 years, but the justices that he will appoint will go on for many years, handing down Republican decisions. 9 justices, and you get to appoint 4. You really can stack the court in that manner, because you've already got Republican justices on there, and if you get to appoint 4, you are definitely going to tip the court. 4 out of the 9. It is quite remarkable if our current president gets to appoint 3, if he can, before the election here and his term is out, get to appoint the 3rd Supreme Court justice to the court. So in his 4 years, Trump, if he gets to appoint 3. But here, Harding got to appoint 4. Harding's fortunate choice for Chief Justice was ex-President Taft, who not only performed his duties ably, but surprisingly was more liberal than some of his cautious associates. In the first years of the 1920s, the Supreme Court axed progressive legislation. It killed a federal child labor law, stripped away many of labor's hard-won gains, and rigidly restricted governmental intervention in the economy. The court invalidated a minimum wage law for women. What would it use for deciding a minimum wage law for women does not apply? Its strained ruling was that because females now had the right to vote, they could no longer be protected by special legislation. So you women want a minimum wage law? You have the right to vote. Go ahead and get your own legislation put through Congress, vote it into law, and you may now have a minimum wage. But you're not going to get it based upon special concessions as you got in the past. And peace after World War I. I hope you are following along in the lecture outline that is given to you on D2L, that you've printed it out and have that in front of you. Making peace with the defeated enemy was the most pressing problem left on Harding's doorstep. The U.S., having rejected the Treaty of Versailles, was still technically at war with Germany, Austria, and Hungary, nearly 3 years after the armistice had been signed. The armistice is merely a ceasefire. It is not a treaty. Wilson had gone to Europe to work out the treaty, but having not taken high-level Republicans with him, when he brings back the treaty, the Republicans in Congress refuse to sign on to the Treaty of Versailles. They said, we had no part in the making of this, and they are not about to sign. And so, here we are. The rest of Europe has signed the Treaty of Versailles, and yet the United States has not signed it. In July 1921, Congress passed a simple joint resolution which declared the war officially ended. In August, the next month, Washington negotiated separate peace with Germany, with Austria, and with Hungary. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire no longer exists. You have a country of Austria, you have a country of Hungary. One of Wilson's 14 points, no separate secret treaties. Well, who's the first to violate this? Well, I guess this isn't secret, but this is definitely a separate treaty. Meanwhile, Bolshevik Russia from the outset had been getting the cold shoulder from Washington. Wilson's administration had bluntly refused to recognize the new communist dictatorship of Moscow. Wilson could do no other. Remember, Wilson would not recognize Huerta. You didn't hold fair elections. You got into office through bloody means. Then he wouldn't recognize Carranza. You didn't hold fair elections. You got into office through bloody means. Well, the communists, the Bolshevik Revolution takes place. Do you think that Wilson is now going to recognize Russia? Not a chance. Now, you can't just blame Wilson for this. He viewed the Russian communists as moral lepers and economic outcasts, but succeeding Republican administrations would cling tenaciously to this policy for a total of 16 years. It would not be until the Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes into office that the U.S. would finally recognize communist Russia as the legitimate government of Russia. But America's distaste America's distaste for the Bolsheviks did not stifle her humanitarian impulses. When a tumultuous famine strikes Russia in 1921, the Republican Congress, seconded by private benefactors, voted $20 million for relief. This relief was not sent to the communists. It was not sent to the Russian government. It was sent to the Russian people. The Republicans said, the American nation said, we have no problem with the Russian people. It is your government we have a problem with. But we're not going to stand by and let you Russians starve to death. Here, Chicago newspaper, 6 million perish in Soviet famine. 6 million. Peasants' crops seized. They and their animals starve. Look at the bones on this animal. Piles upon piles of carcasses, ribs showing, nothing but skin and bones. Reporter risks life to get photographs showing starvation. Here, 5 young kids. These bloated bellies are not because they are full. You can see their ribs, their skinniness. This has to do with disease, malnutrition. This is not because they're full. Here, 2 little, I would assume, brothers. One trying to help feed the other what probably little food they have. Skin and bones. Cannibalism takes place always in times of famine. An arm, a foot, an arm. Bartering, selling body parts to try and survive. Little child, nothing but skin and bones. Once again, the selling of body parts during the famine. A huge mission of mercy was administered under the experienced hand of the great humanitarian. We gather huge supplies to send to Russia. Here, American canned milk, rice, flour, tea, sugar. We collect it everywhere that we can. And the great humanitarian, Herbert Hoover. Across the nation, people give, not just the government, but American citizens give to try and feed the Russians. Herbert Hoover had fed the Belgians. He had then fed the Americans and the Allies during the war. So who is more experienced and more capable now of feeding the Russians than Herbert Hoover? So he is once again put in charge of feeding the Russians. Did the Russians ever thank us for what we did? I'm sure the Russian people were very thankful. But the Russian government never thanked us. They were very suspicious instead. And we had an unbelievably difficult time getting this food into Russia and distributed. People would go over there and find that it was tied up in red tape at the import locations, was not getting through into the country. We had to push and shove to even get this food administered into Russia. But it was estimated that perhaps 10 million people were saved from starvation in Russia because of the food that the United States sent. Were we against communism? Absolutely. But were we against the Russian people as a whole? No, we did not want them to starve. And ship scrapping at the Washington Conference. Disarmament was a problem that cried desperately for attention. Ew, went all by itself. The U.S. boasted the second largest navy in the world. We had 18 battleships to Britain's 22 battleships. Britain at the end of World War I was still Queen of the Seas, but we were next in line behind Britain. We had the second mightiest navy in the world. The naval race in which Uncle Sam found itself bore all the earmarks of deadly rivalry between Britain and next in line, Japan. Japan was on the rise in Asia. The Washington Disarmament Conference of 1921 through 1922 was therefore called by Harding. As for naval disarmament, the spotlight focused on the big battleships. Secretary Hughes dramatically proposed at Washington a holiday on building battleships and the outright scrapping by the three major powers of dozens built or being built. Remember I said the money was wasted during World War I when we finally got our act together on the building of huge battleships, none of which were done in time to see action during World War I. These are now just completed and being completed, and what do? We scrap them. The scaled-down navies of America and Britain were to enjoy parity, that means equality, in battleships and aircraft carriers. So we would each have battleship tonnage of 525,000 and aircraft tonnage of 135,000, with Japan at the small end of a 5-5-3 ratio. Why are we going to scale down and throw away stuff that has just been built? Well, the concept was, if I have a bigger navy than you do, you feel threatened. So you have to beef up yours even more. But if we all scale down our navies and we all have limits on them, then I won't feel threatened by you because we're equal. And we know you're supposed to be less. Well, Japan sensitive ambassador said, I really don't care for this 553 ratio. To me, this looks like Rolls-Royce, Ford. I don't want our nation to be Ford. To obtain this parity, the U.S. was therefore forced to scrap more than 24 warships that were built or nearing completion. France and Italy would also then have parity between their two nations on an even lesser basis. Well, Wall Street's big bull market. The golden 20s began in 1922 with the end of the post-war depression and the start of a fantastically long boom. After every war, there is a depression or recession, and sure enough, after World War I, we had a depression, and now we've come out of it, and we will start in on a fantastically long boom. A theme song of the period was, my sister, she works in the laundry. My father sells bootlegger gin. My mother, she takes in the washing. My God, how the money rolls in. The stock exchange provided even greater sensations. Speculation ran wild, and an orgy of boom or bust trading pushed the bull market up to dizzying peaks. The bull market. In the United States, when the market is climbing, is doing good, we refer to it as an animal, the bull market. And on Wall Street, many of you have seen in news shots as well as in movies the famous huge bull statue out there on Wall Street. It's in a oblong circular thing, and there's actually the bull on one side and the little girl facing it on the other. Most times they never show the little girl, you just see the bull. But yes, on Wall Street you always want a bull market. If things are going poorly, if the market is going down, it's referred to as another animal. It is the bear market. You never want to have a bear market because that is a falling market. So two animals are referenced for the stock market. You have the bull market and the bear market. Well, we were having the bull market. Stock market provided an even greater sensation. Speculation ran wild, and an orgy of boom or bust trading pushed the bull market up to dizzying peaks. The stock market became a gambling den. Everybody seemed to be buying stocks on margin, that is, with a small down payment. This is part of what will lead to the Great Depression and the stock market crash. People are not buying stocks outright. They are not paying full price for these stocks. They are buying them on margin. That means they're paying a percentage for the stock, 10%, but they are then being issued the stock certificate. You don't own that stock. You only own a percentage of it. So you have all this false sense, paper sense of wealth. Barbers, stenographers, elevator boys. Everyone was cashing in on hot tips picked up while on duty. You're saying, what does an elevator boy have anything to know about the stocks. Well, his job was simply to stand there and push the elevator buttons for people going up and down, for businessmen. All those businessmen are talking as they go up and down, as that elevator boy stands there saying nothing. If he is being smart and listening, he is picking up on an awful lot of information. And if he uses that information, he knows which stocks are hot and which stocks are not. Barbers, why would they know? I'm sure they are cutting hair of businessmen, and if they get them to talking, they would have a lot of information given to them as well. So everyone is cashing in on tips, buying stocks on margin. Side note, this is the Roaring 20s. Everyone is doing well. Well, according to figures of the 1920s compiled by the Brookings Institute, the decade's reputed bubble of prosperity was never as big as it seemed. A handful of people did make fortunes in the stock market and in real estate, but most people were not so lucky. In 1929, why do we talk about 1929? That is the year that the stock market crashed. In 1929, only 2.3% of American families enjoyed an income in excess of $10,000 a year. $10,000 was a pretty hefty income, very hefty income. So only 2.3% had incomes of over $10,000. And just 8% had an income of over $5,000. That is still quite a hefty income back then. Of the others, now you have to understand, this 2.3 is part of this 8%. Of the others, 71% lived on incomes below $2,500. 60% lived on incomes below $2,000. And this 60 is part of that 71%. And 21% lived on incomes less than $1,000. This is not for an individual. This is for families. The Brookings study established that families living on less than $2,000, right here, 60%, on less than $2,000 did not have enough money to meet the bare necessities of life, which means that in the golden year of 1929, 60% of American families were living in poverty, and another 10% were close to it. So, how roaring were the Roaring 20s? Well, the chances were there to become wealthy, but the majority of Americans were still, like today, living as lower income families. On Washington finances, the wartime debt had rocketed from the 1914 figure of $1 billion to the 1921 peak of $23 billion. So before the United States got into World War I, our national debt was $1 billion. Oh, could you imagine that today? We're in the trillions. If we had a national debt of $1 billion. Well, now, in 1921, when the war is over, our national debt is $23 billion. $23 billion. What causes our national debt to go up so high? War. Before World War I, $1 billion. After World War II, $23 billion. The burdensome taxes inherited from the war were especially distasteful to the millionaires, of which our Secretary of the Treasury just so happened to be one. A series of tax reductions were therefore brought about from 1921 to 1926. Congress followed the Secretary's lead by repealing the excess profits tax, abolishing the gift tax, reducing the excise tax, the surtax, the income tax, and the estate taxes. In 1921, a wealthy man with an income of $1 million had paid $663,000 in income taxes. In 1926, after all these reductions, he paid about $200,000. So from $663,000 in taxes down to $200,000. His spare the rich policies thus shifted much of the tax burden from the wealthy to the middle income groups. And to this day, that is who pays most of the income tax, the middle income groups. To his credit, though, he did reduce the national debt by $10 billion. So we did get it down from $21 billion down to $11 billion, all during that short period of time. When we get to World War II, we will find out the huge depression will cost us to go into debt about $40 billion. But in the time period that we are involved in World War II, we will go into debt $250 billion. The Great Depression did not put us into debt. It was World War II. Wars are expensive, extremely expensive. And we will stop at this point and come back with hiking the tariff higher.